In the folklore of the Gulag, there is a sound that signals the end of the world. It isn't the boom of an explosion, and it isn't the scream of a siren. It is a soft, rustling noise, like dry grain being poured onto a tin sheet. The Yakuts call it the whispering of the stars. It is the sound of your own breath freezing instantly as it leaves your mouth, the moisture turning into ice crystals that collide in the air before they even hit the ground. When you hear that sound, you don't need a thermometer. You know it is minus 50 degrees Celsius, and you know that the rules of the human world have just been suspended. My name is Vasily, and for 3 years I was a dynevny, a barrack orderly in the Oymyakon sector of the Kolyma camps. I have seen men die of many things, scurvy, typhus, the butt of a rifle. But the thing that I remember most vividly is not the death of the prisoners. It is the fear of the guards. You might think that the cold was our enemy and their ally. After all, they had the sheepskin coats, the felt boots, and the stoves. We had rags. But you would be wrong. When the mercury dropped past that red line of minus 50, a strange reversal took place. The camp turned upside down. For us, the prisoners, the extreme cold was a savior. For the guards, it was a nightmare. It usually started in the morning lineup, 5 a.m. The darkness was absolute, a thick, heavy blackness that felt like it was pressing against your eyeballs. The searchlights swept across the yard, beams of light cutting through the frozen fog. We stood there, thousands of gray shapes, shivering in a vibration so intense it hummed. We were waiting for the meteorologist. He wasn't a scientist. He was a guard officer who walked out of the administration shack carrying a thermometer. We watched him like hawks. We watched his body language. If he walked briskly, it was only minus 40. That meant work. That meant 12 hours in the gold mines, swinging a pickaxe into rock that sparked like steel. It meant a death for the weak. But if he walked slowly, if he huddled into his collar, if he squinted at the glass tube and hesitated, then a ripple of electricity would shoot through the ranks. On this particular morning in January 1951, the officer stepped out. He checked the thermometer. He tapped it. He checked it again. He looked up at the sky, then back at the glass. He turned to the camp commandant. He didn't shout. He whispered. But in the silence of the frost, we heard the word. Akti. The act. The exemption. A cheer went up from the prisoner ranks. It was a ragged, frozen cheer, but it was genuine joy. Akti meant that it was too cold for the tools. Steel becomes brittle at minus 50. If you strike a frozen rock with a pickaxe, the metal shatters like glass. The machinery, the few trucks and winches we had, would seize up, the oil turning into a useless jelly. And the state reasoned it was economically inefficient to replace broken tools. So the order was given. No work. Back to the barracks. For us, it was a holiday. It meant we could huddle near the stove. It meant we wouldn't freeze our lungs out in the pit. It meant we would live one more day. But as I turned to run back to the barracks, I looked at the face of the young guard nearest to me. His name was Volkov. He was 19, a conscript from Ukraine. He wasn't cheering, he was terrified. His eyes were darting around the compound, scanning the fog that was rapidly thickening. He gripped his PPSH submachine gun so hard his knuckles were white. He knew what was coming. We all did. The Akti days weren't just rest days. They were siege days. When the temperature drops that low, the prison camp becomes a sealed pressure cooker. The guards retreat into their towers and their blockhouses. They are no longer the hunters. They are the trapped. I watched Volkov back away toward the guardhouse. He didn't turn his back on us. He fumbled with the latch of the door, his heavy mittens making him clumsy. He finally got it open and slipped inside, slamming it shut, and I heard it distinctly, throwing the heavy iron bolt. He was locking himself in. Why? Because he knew the physics of the cold better than we did. He knew that outside that door, the ice fog was descending. He knew that in an hour, he wouldn't be able to see his own hand in front of his face. He knew that the watchtowers were now blind, and he knew that he was trapped in a box with 3,000 murderers, thieves, and political fanatics who suddenly had 24 hours of free time and a deep, burning hatred. The cold had stripped him of his eyes, and as the day wore on, he would realize it was about to strip him of his weapons too. The -50 nights were not a time of sleep for the guards. They were a time of waiting for the ghosts to come out of the mist. And the ghosts were us. The sun technically rose at 9 a.m., but in the depths of an Octi day, you wouldn't know it. The world didn't get brighter. It just turned a lighter shade of gray. The phenomenon is called ice fog, or sometimes human habitation fog. It happens when the air is so cold that it can no longer hold any moisture in gas form. Every breath expelled by 3,000 prisoners, every wisp of smoke from the kitchen chimney, every exhaust fume from the diesel generator, it all freezes instantly and hangs in the air. It doesn't drift away like normal smoke. It stays there. It accumulates. It builds a wall. By noon, the visibility in the camp had dropped to less than 2 feet. Standing in the doorway of the barracks, I couldn't see the perimeter fence. I couldn't see the mess hall. And most importantly, I couldn't see the watchtowers. Those towers, usually the all-seeing eyes of God in our miserable universe, had been blinded. I stepped back inside the barracks to stoke the stove. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating. Hundreds of men were packed onto the wooden bunks. The air, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and damp wool drying in the heat. But there was an energy here that didn't exist on normal days. It was the energy of a classroom when the teacher leaves the room. The Urkas, the professional criminals, the Vori, were huddled in the corner, playing cards. They were whispering. They knew that outside, the law had vanished. "Vasily," a voice hissed. I turned. It was Grisha, a thief with a tattoo of a spider on his neck. He was grinning. "Go check the door. Tell me what you see." I went to the window, scraping a peephole in the thick rime of ice on the glass. "I see nothing, Grisha. Just white soup." "Exactly," Grisha said, pulling a sharpened spoon, a shiv, from his boot. "The towers are blind. The guards are shivering in their sheepskins. It's payday." I watched as Grisha and 2 of his lieutenants slipped out the door, vanishing into the fog like ghosts. They weren't escaping. There is nowhere to run at -50. The taiga kills you in minutes. No, they were going to the next barracks. They had a debt to collect from a suka, a bitch, a prisoner who had collaborated with the administration. On a normal day, crossing the open ground between barracks was forbidden. The guards would fire a warning shot, then a kill shot. But today the guards were staring into a white void. 10 minutes later, I heard a scream. It was muffled, flat, deadened by the heavy air. It came from the direction of Barrack 4. Then I heard the reaction from the tower. Rat-tat-tat-tat. A machine gun burst, but the guard wasn't aiming. He was firing blindly into the mist, panic in his trigger finger. He had heard the scream. He knew something was wrong, but he was powerless to stop it. He was shooting at phantoms. The bullets hit the roof of our barracks. Thwack, thwack. Splinters of wood rained down on the upper bunks. Men cursed, rolling onto the floor. But then, laughter erupted. We were laughing at them. We were laughing at the mighty Soviet guard who was wasting his precious ammunition on the sky. Grisha returned a moment later. He was calm, wiping his shiv on his pants. He sat back down at the card game. "Done," he said simply. The door to the barracks opened again, and a gust of ice fog rolled in, followed by a frantic figure. It wasn't a prisoner. It was Lieutenant Kovalenko, the sector commander. He was wrapped in furs, his face a mask of ice, icicles hanging from his eyelashes. He had a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. He looked terrified. He had just run the gauntlet from the guardhouse to the barracks through the blinding fog, knowing that any shadow could have been a prisoner with a knife waiting to gut him. "Head count!" Kovalenko screamed, his voice cracking. "Everyone on their bunks! Now!" He was trying to reassert control. He wanted to prove that he was still the master, but as he walked down the aisle, swinging his lantern, I saw his hand shaking. He wasn't checking our faces. He was checking that we were still contained. He walked quickly, nervously, his eyes darting to the dark corners where the light didn't reach. He knew that in this fog, the camp belonged to the inmates. He was just a tourist in our hell. And as he passed Grisha, the thief didn't look down. He looked right at the officer and smiled. Kovalenko didn't say a word. He just gripped his pistol tighter and hurried toward the door, desperate to get back to the safety of the blind watchtower. The cold is a mechanic. It disassembles machines as easily as it kills men. That afternoon, I was ordered to the guardhouse. As a trusty, my job was to haul coal for the officer's stove and empty the slop buckets. It was a privileged position because it meant I could steal scraps of food, but on acty days, it was a front-row seat to the unraveling of the Soviet authority. The guardhouse was overheated, a stifling box of sweating men and stale tobacco smoke. The guards were off rotation, huddled around the cast-iron stove. They weren't playing cards. They weren't joking. They were stripping their weapons. At -50 degrees, standard Soviet gun oil turns into a substance resembling thick glue or jelly. The tolerances of the PPSH-41 submachine gun, the weapon that won the Great Patriotic War, were loose, which usually made it reliable in mud. But in this extreme cold, the metal contracted. The springs lost their tension, the firing pins became sluggish. I dumped a scuttle of coal into the fire, trying to be invisible. I watched Private Volkov, the young guard I had seen earlier, trying to cycle the bolt of his weapon. He pulled the charging handle back. It moved slowly, resisting him like it was stuck in molasses. When he let go, the bolt didn't snap forward with a metallic clack. It slid forward slowly. Schlook! It didn't go all the way into battery. Volkov looked at the sergeant. "It's gummed up again, Comrade Sergeant. The spring is frozen." "Strip it," the sergeant barked, though I could see the worry in his own eyes. "Clean it dry. No oil. Use kerosene." "I did," Volkov argued, panic rising in his voice. "I stripped it an hour ago. It's the metal itself. It's shrinking. If I have to fire, it will jam on the second round." "Then don't miss with the first one," the sergeant snapped. This was the dirty secret of the -50 nights. The guards were effectively disarmed. Oh, they had rifles and pistols, but they were unreliable. If a prisoner charged them, they might get one shot off, maybe two, before the mechanism failed. And against 3,000 men, a single shot is nothing. I saw a captain sitting near the window, or where the window would be if it wasn't covered in 3 inches of ice. He was holding his Tokarev pistol. He was doing something insanely dangerous. He was holding the receiver of the pistol near the red-hot belly of the stove. He was trying to warm the metal to keep the oil fluid. "Careful, sir," Volkov whispered. "The ammunition." "Shut up," the captain growled. He knew the risk. If the heat cooked off a round in the chamber, the gun would explode in his hand. But he preferred that risk to the alternative, standing in the fog with a frozen lump of steel while a gang of Urkas advanced on him with knives. I finished my work and picked up the slop bucket. As I walked to the door, the captain looked at me. Usually, a guard looks through a prisoner, but today, he looked at me. He was assessing me. He was wondering if I knew. He was wondering if the camp knew that their masters were holding toy guns. I lowered my eyes, playing the role of the dumb peasant. "Just taking out the slop, Citizen Chief," I mumbled. "Make it quick, Vasily," he said. His voice wasn't commanding, it was almost pleading. "Don't linger by the wire. The dogs are restless." I nodded and stepped out into the airlock. The cold hit me like a physical punch. I walked into the white blindness of the yard. The captain's warning about the dogs lingered in my mind. Restless. That was a lie. I knew dogs. I grew up with hunting hounds in the village. Dogs aren't restless in this weather. They are broken. I walked past the kennel run on my way to the latrine pit. The kennels were usually a terrifying place, a cacophony of barking and snarling Alsatians trained to tear a man's throat out. Today, there was silence. I peered through the wire mesh. The dogs were curled into tight balls at the back of their wooden boxes. They were shivering violently. I saw one dog, a massive brute named Terror, standing near the fence. His nose, his primary weapon, his radar, was covered in frost. He was pawing at his snout, whining. The mucus inside his nose had frozen. He couldn't smell me. He couldn't smell anything. I stood there, a prisoner holding a bucket of slop, 10 feet from a killer beast, and I felt a surge of dark power. The guards were blind in the fog. Their guns were jammed with frozen oil, and their biological alarms, the dogs, were neutralized. The realization hit me with the force of a revelation. The fences were still there, yes. The gates were locked. But the power had evaporated with the temperature. For the next 24 hours, until the mercury rose, we were the ones in control. And looking at the blind, shivering dog, I wondered how long it would be before the rest of the camp figured it out. And when they did, God helped the men in the sheepskin coats. The silence of the kennels was, in many ways, more terrifying than their usual noise. In the Gulag, the Alsatian dogs were not animals. They were biological weapons. They were fed better than the prisoners, meat, fat, and warm porridge, because a starving dog is useless. They were trained to hate the smell of gray padded jackets. On a normal day, walking past the dog run was a gauntlet of snarling, snapping jaws throwing themselves against the chain-link fence, desperate to tear you apart. But on an 88 Acti day, the biology of the beast fails just as surely as the mechanics of the gun. I stood by the kennel, watching Sergeant Belov, the head dog handler, trying to coax his prize animal out of its wooden shelter. The dog, a massive beast named Sultan, was huddled in the back corner on a bed of straw. Sultan was a legend in the camp. It was said he had torn the throat out of an escapee 2 years ago in the tundra. But today, Sultan looked like a frightened puppy. "Come out, you devil!" Belov shouted, tugging on the leash. "Patrol! Walk!" The dog whined, a high, pitiful sound, and dug its claws into the wood. Belov pulled harder. The dog slid across the floor, resisting with every ounce of its weight. When Belov finally dragged him out into the snow, the animal immediately began the dance of the frozen. He lifted one paw, then the other, hopping frantically to keep his pads off the ice. The ground temperature was likely -55. At that temperature, ice burns like a hot skillet. Belov cursed and kicked the dog in the ribs. It wasn't an act of cruelty exactly, it was an act of panic. Belov knew that without Sultan, he was blind. The dogs were the early warning system. They could smell a prisoner hiding in a coal pile. They could hear the snip of wire cutters in the dark. But now, Sultan's nose was caked in frost. He was sneezing repeatedly, trying to clear his olfactory sensors, but the mucus inside his snout had crystallized. He was deafened by the ice fog dampening the sound, and he was blinded by the whiteout. Sultan sat down in the snow and refused to move. He tucked his nose into his tail, curling into a tight ball to preserve his core heat. Belov struck him with the leash, but the dog didn't even growl. He just took the beating, shivering violently. The survival instinct had overridden the training. The dog knew that to walk the perimeter for 4 hours was a death sentence. I saw the fear in Belov's eyes. He looked up at the blind watchtowers, then at the thick fog swirling around the barracks, and then down at his useless beast. He realized he was alone. If a prisoner decided to jump him right now, Sultan wouldn't protect him. Sultan was busy dying. Belov looked at me. For a second, our eyes met through the wire. He saw a trusty with a slop bucket, but he also saw a witness to his vulnerability. "What are you looking at, scum?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Get back to your hole!" He dragged the dog back into the kennel and slammed the door. I walked away, the snow crunching loudly under my boots. I realized that the hierarchy of the camp had dissolved. The guards relied on their tools, guns, dogs, fences. But the cold had taken the guns, and now it had taken the dogs. The guards were just men now, soft, frightened men in heavy coats. And inside the barracks there were men who were not soft, men who had been hardened by years of starvation and cruelty, men who were watching the thermometer and waiting for exactly this moment. As I dumped the slop into the frozen pit, I looked toward the perimeter wire. The fog was so thick I couldn't see the fence posts, but I could hear something. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic thumping sound coming from above, from the roofs. The Urkas were coming out to play. The architecture of a Gulag barrack is simple, a long, low wooden structure with a pitched roof covered in tar paper and snow. The roofs are interconnected in long rows, separated only by narrow alleys. In the summer, climbing on the roof was suicide. The tower guards would pick you off before you stood up. But in the ice fog, the roofs became a highway. They became a stage for psychological warfare. I returned to the barracks to find the mood had shifted from tension to a dark, manic exhilaration. The Urkas, the professional criminals, were no longer playing cards. They were dressing. They were wrapping rags around their felt boots to muffle the sound, or perhaps to change the acoustic signature. They were pulling white bedsheets over their padded jackets, primitive camouflage. "Where are you going?" I asked Grisha, the thief who ran our sector. "To go for a walk, Vasily," he grinned, his gold tooth flashing in the gloom. "The guards are lonely in the towers. We're going to keep them company." They slipped out the window at the back of the barracks, climbing up the snowdrifts that had piled against the walls to reach the eaves. I went to the stovepipe, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then, thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of heavy boots running across the hollow wooden roof. It echoed through the barrack, but more importantly, it echoed out into the yard. Because of the fog, sound behaves strangely at -50 degrees. It carries, but it distorts. It's hard to tell where it's coming from. From the perspective of the guard in the watchtower, this must have been terrifying. Imagine standing in a glass box, suspended 30 feet in the air, surrounded by a white void. You can't see the ground, you can't see the next tower, and suddenly you hear footsteps, not below you, but level with you, or running right underneath you. Thump, 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 then a whistle, a sharp, piercing wolf whistle from the fog. "Who goes there?" a guard screamed from the nearest tower. His voice sounded thin and panicked. The answer was a snowball flying out of the mist and hitting the glass of his tower with a loud thwack. Then, laughter. Disembodied, ghostly laughter coming from everywhere and nowhere. The Urkas were running from roof to roof, jumping the gaps. They were taunting the guards. They were throwing chunks of ice at the searchlights. They were creating the illusion of a massive uprising without actually exposing themselves to danger. Then, the shooting started. A guard in Tower 4 cracked. He heard the footsteps on the roof of the warehouse next to his post and opened fire. Bang, bang, bang! The shots were deafening in the heavy air. But he wasn't aiming. He was spraying bullets into the fog. I heard the rounds hitting the wood of the warehouse, splintering the timber. "Hold your fire, you idiot!" The commandant's voice boomed over the loudspeaker system. "Save your ammunition! It's a trick!" But panic is contagious. Another guard in Tower 6 started shooting. He thought the camp was being stormed. Tracers zipped through the fog like angry red hornets, disappearing into the white nothingness. Inside the barracks, the prisoners were cheering. Every shot fired was a bullet that wouldn't be used later. Every wasted magazine was a victory. The Urkas came back in through the window 10 minutes later, breathless, their faces flushed with the cold and the adrenaline. They were laughing, slapping each other on the back. "Did you see him?" Grisha gasped, stripping off his snow-covered sheet. "The one in Tower 4, he was crouching on the floor of the catwalk. He was crying for his mother. It was a game to them. But to me, watching from the safety of the stove, it felt like something more dangerous. They were testing the perimeter. They were probing the reflexes of the guards. They were proving that the all-seeing eye of the state was blind. And as the shooting died down, replaced by the nervous shouting of officers trying to restore discipline, I realized that the balance of terror had shifted. The guards were no longer afraid of us escaping. They were afraid of us coming in. They were afraid that the fog would never lift and that in the white silence, the thumping on the roof would eventually turn into the sound of a door being kicked down. The cold had leveled the playing field, and for the first time in years, the prisoners realized there were more of us than there were of them. The reality of the Gulag is that even when the world stops, the hunger does not. By 2 p.m. on that frozen afternoon, the Akti day faced a crisis. The camp kitchen, usually a place of steam and noise, had gone silent. The coal bunker behind the mess hall was empty. Without coal, the massive cauldrons of balanda, the watery soup that kept us alive, would freeze into blocks of ice. Without soup, 3,000 men would riot, regardless of the temperature. The coal depot was located outside the perimeter wire, about 400 meters down the logging road. On a normal day, this was a routine 10-minute job for a work detail. Today, it was an expedition to the North Pole. I was in the kitchen, trying to steal a raw potato, when the quartermaster stormed in. He looked at the empty bunker, cursed, and turned to the guard detail huddled by the door. "You," he pointed at a massive red-faced sergeant named Petrov, "take 3 men, go to the depot, get the coal." Petrov looked at the quartermaster as if he had been ordered to walk into a volcano. "Outside?" Petrov stammered. "In this, the fog is solid. We'll get lost before we reach the gate." "Follow the guide rope," the quartermaster snapped, "and take the sled. If the prisoners don't eat tonight, they'll tear this camp apart, and I'll let them start with you." Petrov grumbled, his face pale. He turned to the prisoners. Vasily, he barked at me. And you, get the sled. We harnessed ourselves to the heavy wooden sled like mules. Petrov didn't tie us up. He knew we wouldn't run. Run where? Into the white void to freeze in 5 minutes? The cold was a better shackle than any chain. We stepped out of the gate. The world disappeared instantly. The guide rope was a thick hemp line strung between posts, waist high, leading to the depot. It was our only tether to reality. If you let go of that rope in the ice fog, you could wander in circles 10 feet from safety until you froze. We walked with our heads down, the ice crystals forming a crust on our eyelashes instantly. I had to blink constantly to keep my eyes from sealing shut. Sergeant Petrov walked behind us. I could hear his heavy breathing through his scarf. He was murmuring curses. He was a heavy smoker, a man whose fingers were yellow with nicotine. About halfway to the depot, the sled hit a rut and stopped. We strained against the ropes. "Hold up!" Petrov yelled. His voice sounded muffled and distant, even though he was 5 feet away. "Let me catch my breath." He wasn't tired. He was withdrawing. The stress of the Octi day, the fear of the prisoners, the cold, it was too much. He needed a fix. I turned and saw a blurry shape in the fog. Petrov was fumbling with his gloves. He was trying to roll a cigarette. "Citizen Sergeant," I whispered, the wind snatching my words away. "Don't stop. We have to keep moving. The blood—" "Shut your mouth, filth," Petrov growled. He managed to light the match, shielding it inside his coat. The flare of the flame illuminated his face, red, sweating, frantic. He took a drag. The smoke mixed with the ice fog. He sat down on the edge of the sled to enjoy it. That is the mistake. In the civilized world, you sit down to rest. In -50 degrees, you sit down to die. The moment you stop moving, your body's heat generation drops. The blood, desperate to keep the heart and brain alive, retreats from the limbs. The feeling of cold vanishes, replaced by a warm, heavy comfort. I watched it happen in real time. Petrov took 3 drags, then his hand dropped to his knee. The cigarette fell into the snow. His head lolled forward. "Sergeant," I called out. He didn't answer. He just sat there looking like a statue. My partner, a grim Ukrainian named Lev, looked at me. "Leave him," Lev whispered. "Let him freeze. It's justice." "If we come back without him, they shoot us," I said. "Help me." We grabbed Petrov. He was dead weight. He wasn't dead yet, but the sweet sleep had him. We threw him onto the sled on top of the empty coal sacks. We ran the rest of the way to the depot, loaded the coal around his slump body, and dragged the whole load back. When we crashed through the camp gates, the other guards rushed out. They pulled Petrov off the coal. His face was white as wax. His eyebrows were frosted over. They slapped him, poured vodka into his mouth, and dragged him toward the stove. He survived, but he lost all his fingers and his nose. He never held a rifle again. And the prisoners in the kitchen? We just unloaded the coal. We realized that out there in the fog, the rank of sergeant meant nothing. The cold had stripped him of his authority as easily as it stripped the heat from his body. We were the mules, and we had survived. He was the master, and he had broken. While the drama of the coal run played out on the ground, a different, more psychological horror was unfolding in the sky. The watchtowers of the Gulag were solitary confinement cells on stilts. A guard was assigned an 8-hour shift. He climbed up the icy ladder, locked himself in the small wooden cabin, and stood watch over the zone. On a clear day, it was boring. On an Octi day, it was a torture chamber designed to break the human mind. The guard in Tower 3 was a man named Corporal Dima. I knew him because I cleaned the barracks. He was a nervous man, prone to superstition, from a village deep in the Urals. He believed in ghosts, and sitting in Tower 3 during a whiteout was exactly the place where ghosts are born. At -50, the windows of the tower freeze over completely. The guards have to keep a small peephole scraped clear, but looking through it is useless. All they see is white, swirling mist. They are suspended in a cloud. They can hear the sounds of the camp below, the urkas running on the roofs, the distant shouts, the barking of the dogs. But they are disconnected from it. This sensory deprivation, combined with the extreme cold leaking through the floorboards, induces a condition we called Vorkuta madness. It starts with the eyes. Staring at a uniform white field causes the brain to invent contrast. You start to see shadows that aren't there. You see shapes moving in the fog. I was in the yard, clearing a path to the latrine. when I looked up at Tower 3. It was barely visible, just a dark square floating in the sky. Suddenly, the searchlight on top of the tower snapped on. It swept frantically back and forth, the beam illuminating nothing but millions of dancing ice crystals. It looked like a lightsaber cutting through milk. Then, Dima started screaming. They're climbing the legs!" His voice was thin and hysterical, drifting down from the sky. There was no one climbing the tower. The wooden legs were coated in 2 inches of slick ice. A squirrel couldn't have climbed them. But Dima didn't see ice. He saw monsters. Bang, bang, bang. He opened fire. He was leaning out of the trapdoor in the floor of the tower, shooting straight down at the base of his own post. The bullets impacted the frozen mud near the perimeter wire, kicking up sprays of dirt. Get back! Get back!" he shrieked. The entire camp froze. The Urkas on the roof stopped running. The guards in the blockhouse scrambled for their weapons. "Tower 3, report!" the commandant bellowed over the loudspeaker. "What do you see?" "Fire!" Dima screamed back. "The prisoners are on fire! They are burning the posts!" There was no fire. It was a heat hallucination. When you are freezing to death, when your core temperature drops to dangerous levels, the brain sometimes misfires. It tells you that you are hot. Victims of hypothermia often strip off their clothes in the final stages. Paradoxical undressing. Dima was freezing in his tower, but his broken mind saw flames. "Cease fire, Corporal," the commandant ordered. "It is a hallucination. There is no fire." "But you cannot command a man out of a nightmare." Dima emptied his magazine. Then he threw his empty gun out of the tower. Then he started throwing his clothes, first his sheepskin hat, then his heavy coat. They fluttered down through the fog like wounded birds, landing softly in the snow. "I'm burning!" he wailed. A team of guards had to put on crampons and climb the icy ladder to get him. They had to break down the door. We watched as they lowered him down with a rope, a shivering, half-naked man who was fighting them, convinced he was engulfed in flames. They dragged him away to the infirmary. The tower stood empty, the door swinging in the wind. The searchlight was still on, a useless beam cutting through the blindness. We stood in the yard watching. We didn't laugh this time. It wasn't funny. It was a stark reminder of what the cold could do. It could reach inside a man's skull and twist reality until he destroyed himself. The guards were supposed to be the watchers, the unwavering eyes of the state. But the cold had turned them into raving lunatics. We looked at each other, pulling our rags tighter. We were cold, yes. We were hungry. But we were sane. Because down here in the mud, we had each other. Up there in the sky, they were all alone. And in the Gulag, solitude is the quickest way to death. As evening fell on the Okti day, the camp descended into a darkness so profound it felt like being buried alive. The searchlights were either broken by ice or simply swallowed by the fog. The guards had retreated almost entirely into the administration blockhouse, tending to their frozen sergeant and their hallucinating comrade. They had ceded the territory of the zone to us. And in the Gulag, a vacuum of power is never left empty. While the Urkas played their games on the roofs, the politicals, the engineers, the scientists, the men arrested for thinking too much, saw a different opportunity. They didn't want to taunt the guards, they wanted to cripple the machine. I was in the generator shed, ostensibly fetching a bucket of ash, when I saw engineer Kogan and his team at work. Kogan was a genius who had helped design dams before his arrest. Now, he was looking at the main power cables that ran from the diesel generator to the guard towers. These were thick, rubber-coated lines strung on wooden poles. At -55 degrees, the rubber insulation had become as hard and brittle as glass. The copper wire inside was contracted to its breaking point. "Vasily," Kogan whispered, seeing me, "bring the water." I didn't ask questions. I brought a bucket of tepid water from the cooling vat. Kogan took a ladle. He didn't cut the wire. That would leave a tool mark. That would be sabotage, punishable by execution. Instead, he climbed onto a crate and gently poured the water over the tension point of the cable where it connected to the insulator. The physics were brutal and instant. The water froze upon contact, expanding into ice. The expansion exerted a massive sudden pressure on the already stressed cable, Snap! The sound was like a whip crack. The thick cable sheared clean in half, whipping back and coiling like a dead snake in the snow. Sparks showered down, illuminating the fog for a split second before vanishing. Natural causes, Kogan smiled, wiping his hands. Weather damage. The metal couldn't take the thermal shock. They moved to the motor pool next. The trucks, the pride of the camp transport, were sitting idle. The guards had left them running earlier to keep the engines warm, but as the temperature dropped, they had stalled. Now, the blocks were cooling. Kogan and his men opened the hoods. They didn't smash anything. They simply poured cold water over the hot cast iron manifolds. Crack, crack, crack. The sound of iron fracturing. The engine blocks split down the middle. These trucks would never run again. When the thaw came, the guards would try to start them, and the engines would simply seize. It was a silent, invisible war. We were dismantling the prison around us, using the cold as our weapon. The guards huddled in their warm room, drinking vodka, had no idea that their infrastructure was dying. They thought they were waiting out a storm. They didn't realize that the storm was systematically destroying their ability to control us. Then, the lights flickered. The main circuit, compromised by Kogan's weather damage, began to fail. The few bulbs remaining in the yard dimmed, flared once, and died. Total darkness. A shout went up from the guardhouse. I could hear the panic. They were blind before, but now they were in the dark ages. They couldn't see the fence. They couldn't see the gate. "They're coming!" a guard screamed from the darkness. "They cut the power." "No!" the commandant's voice roared back, though it sounded shaky. "It's the cold! The line snapped! Get the flares! Someone get the flares!" But flares don't work well at -50. The chemical reaction is sluggish. When they finally fired one into the sky, it sputtered and died before it hit the apex, casting a weak, sickly red glow over the camp for just a second. In that red flash, I saw the faces of the prisoners standing in the yard. They weren't looking at the ground. They were looking at the fence. The sabotage was done. The lights were out. The guards were blind, deaf, and frozen. The stage was set for the final act of madness. A group of lifers, men with 25-year sentences who had nothing left to lose, were moving toward the perimeter. They weren't going to fix the cables. They were going to try to walk through the wall. The breakout attempt of January 1951 was not a rational act. It was a suicide pact born of opportunity. The men who led it were the bespredel, the limitless ones. Men who had survived the horrors of the war only to be rotting in the ice. They knew they couldn't survive a trek through the tundra. They didn't care. They just wanted to die with their hands around a guard's throat. The darkness gave them cover. The ice fog gave them stealth. The failure of the guns gave them a chance. I watched from the doorway of the barracks. I couldn't participate. I wanted to live, but I couldn't look away. A group of 20 men moved toward the southern perimeter. They carried mattresses from the barracks. They carried planks of wood ripped from the latrine. They reached the wire. The barbed wire was coated in inches of rime ice, making it thick and jagged. On a normal night, touching it would trigger an alarm or a searchlight. Tonight, the power was dead. They threw the mattresses over the wire. The sound was muffled by the snow. They climbed. "Halt!" A scream from the darkness. A guard patrolling on foot had stumbled upon them. The guard raised his rifle. Click. The firing pin froze. He racked the bolt. Click. He shouted in terror, fumbling for the whistle around his neck, but the whistle was metal. When he put it to his lips, the moisture instantly froze the pea inside. It made a pathetic, breathless squeak. The prisoners were on him in seconds. They didn't have knives. They used ice scrapers. They used their bare hands. The fight was silent and brutal, a scuffle of shadows in the fog. The guard went down, buried under a pile of gray jackets, but the noise drew others. The door to the guardhouse burst open. The commandant and his reserve squad spilled out, carrying lanterns and bayonets. They knew their guns were useless. They were charging into a medieval melee. "Fix bayonets!" the commandant screamed. "Push them back!" What followed was a scene from a nightmare. In the swirling white fog, illuminated only by the jerking beams of lanterns, men fought for the fence. The prisoners surged forward, throwing chunks of ice, swinging wooden boards. The guards stabbed with their bayonets, slipping on the frozen ground. I saw a prisoner grab the barrel of a guard's rifle with his bare hands. The skin of his palms must have seared onto the frozen metal instantly, fusing him to the weapon. He didn't let go. He yanked the gun away, spinning it around to use as a club. "Shoot! Why aren't you shooting?" a young guard wailed, pulling his trigger uselessly. "Club them!" the commandant roared, swinging a shovel he had grabbed from the snowbank. It was a stalemate of exhaustion. The prisoners couldn't get through the sheer number of guards pouring out, and the guards couldn't stop the prisoners with firepower. It was a brawl in a freezer. Blood didn't flow. It steamed and froze into red slush on the coats. Men fell, gasping, their lungs burning from the exertion of fighting in the super-cooled air. Eventually, the sheer weight of the guards won out. They formed a phalanx, shoulder to shoulder, and pushed the prisoners back from the wire, using shields made of crate lids and rifle butts. The prisoners retreated, dragging their wounded, vanishing back into the fog like receding waves. The guards didn't pursue. They couldn't. They were terrified that if they stepped too far into the zone, they would be swallowed by the darkness and never seen again. They stood at the fence, panting, their lanterns trembling. They had held the line, but just barely. I stood shivering in the doorway, realizing I had just witnessed the impossible. The Soviet Union, the nuclear superpower, had been reduced to men fighting with sticks in the dark because the weather had decided to disarm them. The guards retreated to their blockhouse, bolting the door again. They wouldn't come out for the rest of the night. They would wait for the sun. They would wait for the mercy of the thermometer. And we waited too, tending to the men who had been stabbed, knowing that when the fog lifted, the reckoning would come. The end of an Octi period is not a relief. It is a sentence. The next morning, I stood by the window, scraping the ice away. The gray light outside seemed brighter. The fog was thinning. I could see the outline of the fence. I could see the dark shape of the watchtower. The door to the administration shack opened. The meteorologist stepped out. He looked different today. He walked with a straighter spine. He wasn't huddled in fear. He marched to the thermometer stand. We held our breath. He checked the glass. He turned to the barracks. He didn't whisper this time. He took a deep breath of air that was no longer liquid ice. -40, he bellowed. "Work detail, form up." -40. It sounds insanely cold to a free man. To us, it meant the guns would work. It meant the trucks would start if Kogan hadn't cracked the engines. It meant the dogs could smell again. The camp transformed instantly. The guards poured out of the blockhouse. They weren't the frightened, huddled men of yesterday. They were angry. They were humiliated. They remembered the snowballs, the jeering from the roofs, the hand-to-hand fight at the wire, and they wanted blood. "Everyone out! Now!" They beat the doors with their rifle butts. We stumbled out into the yard. The visibility was returning, and with the visibility came the evidence. We saw the broken cables lying in the snow. We saw the bloodstains near the fence where the breakout had failed. We saw the dead body of Sergeant Petrov, who had lost his fingers and apparently died of complications during the night, being carried out on a stretcher. The commandant stood on the podium. His face was a mask of fury. He held his pistol. He fired a shot into the air. Crack. The sound was sharp, crisp. The oil had thawed. The weapon was lethal again. "You thought the winter would save you," he spat. "You thought you could rule this camp because the fog hid you, but the fog is gone, and I am still here." He walked down the line. He selected 10 men at random. It didn't matter if they were the ones who fought at the wire or the ones who slept through it. He needed to re-establish the hierarchy of fear. "Sabotage," he said, pointing to the broken generator lines. "Attempted escape." He executed them right there in the snow. 10 shots, 10 bodies. The dogs, now recovered and snarling, strained at their leashes, eager to smell the fresh blood. We stood silent. We didn't cheer. We didn't fight back. The moment had passed. The Octi was over. We were slaves again. I spent the rest of the day hauling coal. The work was brutal. The cold was still biting, but my mind was elsewhere. I looked at the guards. They were shouting, hitting, posturing, but I saw their eyes. I saw the way they looked at the sky when a cloud passed over the sun. They were terrified. They knew now. They knew that their power was fragile. They knew that it depended entirely on a few degrees of temperature. They knew that if the mercury dropped again, their guns would jam, their dogs would fail, and they would be locked in the dark with us. I realized then why the guards feared the -50 nights more than we did. For us, the cold was just another way to die, and we were used to dying. But for them, the cold was the stripper of illusions. It stripped away their uniforms, their ranks, and their technology, leaving them naked and trembling in the dark. I walked back to the barracks that night, listening to the crunch of snow under my boots. It was -42. Cold, but manageable. I looked up at the stars. They were bright, hard diamonds. They weren't whispering anymore. But I knew that soon they would whisper again. And when they did, the guards would lock their doors, and the camp would belong to us.